the longer it goes on, there is a risk of something happening within the country against Putin. And I'm not sure he'd particularly want to risk that. The longer the war goes on, it doesn't get any better for Russia. More casualties, more loss of economic power, more erosion of its international standing. I would think eventually I think actually Putin would probably want to talk peace now. The question is obviously, what the deal would be, whether the Ukrainians will be willing to negotiate. But I think perhaps towards the end of the year, there may be some scope for some kind of negotiation.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by Timothy Ash, an economist with a key focus on Ukraine, Russia and Turkey. He's an associate fellow in the Russia-Eurasia programme at the London-based think tank Chatham House and a senior strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Timothy, good to speak to you. Nice to see you. Let's start by looking at the state of the Russian economy. When you last talked to Frontline in April, you described how Russia prepared the economy for the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But it was anything but the quick toppling of Zelensky they might have been planning for. In what state do you see the economy right now?
Well, pretty much similar. I mean, it's not performing particularly well. It's surviving, as I mentioned previously. Sanction regimes can survive a long time. Look at Cuba, look at Venezuela, North Korea, Iran. They learn to live with sanctions and, they divert resources typically away from consumption to military spending. That's kind of painful for the population. But as I mentioned before, Russia has a lot of durability, build up a lot of reserves. They're still there. Suggestions, though, we've seen recently some secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions essentially are the US and its allies essentially tell third countries, the guys like Turkey, like Central Asia, or China even, be careful in trading with Russia, and if you try and get around sanctions and help Russia, we will sanction you. So there's some evidence now that the Chinese and some of those third countries are beginning to reduce their trade with Russia. So I think things are getting a little bit more difficult for Russia now, and actually some of those reserves that I mentioned have been worn down a bit more.
On sanctions, can we just take a step back and could you just give us an overview of exactly what sanctions are in place against Moscow and how much international consensus there is on those sanctions?
Well, we've seen sanctions on individuals within the regime, key business people, oligarchs, for example. We've seen key Russian companies sanctioned, banks, major energy companies, utility companies. And we've seen trade sanctions. So, for example, the West has sanctioned trade in energy, gas, oil, gold, recently coal, just making it much more difficult for Russia to transact globally. There's also been an oil price cap where the West has basically said, we recognize that oil is an important commodity for the international economy. If we ban Russian exports completely, we'll crash the global energy market. That won't be very good for the global economy, won't be good for us either. But what we can do is try and limit the amount of money that Russia gets from this trade. So it imposes a $60 a barrel limit on what Russia can sell for its oil. Now, it's trying to get around that, actually, and it's learned to get around that through using a shadow fleet of its own ships so it can get around compliance. But actually, in the end, I think it has actually limited the flows of energy and receipts from those exports of oil. So it's pretty complicated, complex. There's a cobweb of sanctions around Russia. It makes it very difficult. Companies that do want to transact, there are costs of doing that. And I think more generally, what these sanctions mean is they increase the cost to Russia of trade. It means they have to spend more on imports. It costs them more because it's more complicated. As I said, third countries, are a bit nervous about doing trade with Russia, so they charge Russia more. And on the export side, Russia has to sell all its commodities at a discount. So in the end, the inflows to Russia are reduced because of it, but they don't go to zero because Russia is obviously a huge commodity and energy exporter. And, again, the West is very reluctant to completely sanction Russia because of the impact on global markets.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about those shadow fleets in a moment, but I just wanted to ask you about Washington recently introducing another package against Russia's financial, energy and technology infrastructure. Can you explain how this builds on what was already in place?
Well, interestingly, I mean, the West has sanctioned many banks, many Russian banks. There's this international financial transaction system called SWIFT, and it's cut many Russian banks away from that system. There are, because of the need still to have Russia as an exporter of commodities, there is still need for a transaction. So a limited number of Russian banks and international banks, particularly Chinese banks, have been allowed to continue to trade. What was interesting about the last set of sanctions, though, it sanctioned MOEX, which is it's a trading platform, a trading exchange based in Moscow, and the Americans essentially banned that exchange. Well, it sanctioned that exchange, and they actually they carry out a lot of these transactions in dollars. Many people trade lots of different products through the MOEX exchange using the dollars. Now that really complicated things, and actually a lot of those third-party countries and their companies kind of gave up. They kind of thought, actually, this is just too complicated now. And we've seen real complications for Russia. We actually, interestingly, immediately after the imposition of those sanctions, we saw people lining up outside Russian banks because they worried about their ability to get dollars. And I think, it will make it more difficult for Russians to access dollars. And again, it's making life more difficult for Russia. That will weigh on the overall economy. It will weigh on Russia's ability to regenerate its conventional military capability that's been lost in Ukraine, and reduce their ability to wage offensive actions against us, malign actions against the West. So they all help, but they're all pretty piecemeal and kind of limited. That's the problem. One of the problems with this.
In that light, then, do you think that if this part of the aim of this is to hamper Russia's ability to continue going on in the war in Ukraine, do you think that this is only a small part?
Look, absolutely. What's kind of interesting now is, initially sanctions were imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its intervention in Donbass, right? And then we saw a ramping up of sanctions, obviously, in February 22 with the full-scale invasion. And the message was, we're doing this because we don't like what you're doing in Ukraine. Please stop. And so then there's a question, well, what happens if Russia stops doing all those things? Will sanctions be completely rolled off? And I think there's been a realization dawning in the West that actually Russia is a long-term threat to Western liberal market democracy. It's not just about Ukraine. He's attacking us. Whatever happens in Ukraine, we have to reduce Russia's military capability. And that would suggest that sanctions will remain in place for a long time because it's in our interests to weaken the Russian economy, to weaken Putin's ability to, again, regenerate and rebuild and advance its military capability, because he will use that against us in the future. So sanctions remain in place for a long time. Now, the other question is, well, surely we could do more. And perhaps we haven't done enough. I mean, I think we haven't done enough. We've been overly cautious. We've been overly cautious because, yes, we are worried about the unintended consequences of some of the sanctions, disruptions to global markets, for example. There's been a huge amount of lobbying by Western companies that still actually want to do business and make profits from Russia. Many individual countries, as G7 or Western partners in the Western alliance supporting Ukraine and against Russia, that have been trying to moderate sanctions because they argue that they're having a disproportionate impact on their own economy. So there's a lot of wrangling. They're incredibly complicated, and the net result of that, it's been sanctions by the highest common denominator. We end up doing less than we need to do, right?
And on that objective to reduce Russia's military capability, a recent RISI report points out the failure by Ukraine's allies and international partners to significantly curb Russian defense production. Where is the problem exactly? Is it just that we are too slow to react, or is it a combination of factors?
Well, it's a combination of factors. I mean, I'd say overall sanctions are not harsh enough. They've been too slow to be rolled out. there's again all the lobbying I mentioned. Sanction regimes try and get around them, right? So we've not been deft enough in terms of our response. A key problem is dual-use goods, for example. I mean, there are products that are used in tanks, they're used in washing machines. Russia has been importing a lot of those products like washing machines or cars from third countries, and then taking them apart and essentially using the microchips, etc., for military production. So now the West is actually again tightening up. There's a real focus on those dual-use products, and I think now again with the sanctions on MOEX, as I mentioned before, on the ability of Russia to transact in dollars and pay for a lot of those things, it's just becoming a lot more difficult. So hopefully that should limit Russia's ability to do that.
So how do you actually tighten up sanctions on dual-use products? How do you do it practically?
Well, you're more specific in terms of you signal to those countries. Again, the third, like Turkey, the Gulf states, Central Asia, Transcaucasia. You signal to those countries that you are going to cast a fine eye on trade with Russia, and particularly on those dual-use products. And if you see Russia is exploiting trade with those countries to get access to those microchips, you will come down very, very hard on those countries and those companies within those countries that are doing those trade. Remember, actually, also, it's not only third countries that are doing these trades. I mean, a lot of Western companies continue to trade in products that Russia is exploiting for its military production, right? I mean, that's unfortunately the harsh reality. So, but again, it's about actions. It's about sanctioning people and sanctioning companies for playing around the rules and trying to circumvent sanctions to make lots of money and to help Russia.
And on that circumvention of sanctions, so for example, I mean, it's obviously a two-way thing. And if you're using a third country, like, for example, Kyrgyzstan, how would you stop a big company, perhaps in the UK, for example, as a sort of imaginary scenario, exporting a car to Russia via Kyrgyzstan?
Well, you have to make it clear to the British company that in the end, this is unusual. I mean, there's been a lot of unusual trade flows, right? Suddenly, there's been a huge increase in trade between Russia and Central Asia in products like cars, right? And it's absolutely crystal clear what it is, what they're doing, how Russia is trying to get around it. So, you signal to those Western companies that are doing those trades that that ultimately these products are ending up in Russian tanks and killing people in Ukraine, and you unfortunately have to have hard conversations with those companies that they need to stop what they're doing because ultimately they are helping Russia in its aggression in Ukraine. And what we've seen is increasingly the West has begun to sanction companies and individuals in those third countries, but actually also in Western countries. We've seen people in Switzerland, in Germany, those individual sanctions. It's about sending a very, very strong message that we know what you're doing. There will be repercussions. You need to stop what you're doing.
On the subject of the shadow fleets we were talking about, Denmark has brought together a group of allies to try and stop the transit of Russia's shadow fleet of tankers from carrying Russian oil through the Baltic Sea. It would affect about a third, as I understand, of Russia's seaborne oil exports. How would that work? And where else could you stop that shadow fleet?
Well, it's pretty complicated. I mean, obviously, the Danes and the Scandis are worried about the environmental impact, right? I mean, essentially, our sanctions have forced Russia not to use well-regulated Western vessels, and they've started this shadow fleet that is unregulated, probably doesn't meet environmental standards. The Danes and the Scandinavians and other countries are worried about the risks of catastrophe. What happens if one of those tankers sinks because it's not well regulated? So it's a really important issue. Ultimately, the response has to be through increased inspections. The West, NATO, and countries like Denmark, etc., have to be willing to deploy naval assets to stop those vessels and do inspections. I mean, that obviously raises issues around direct conflict between Russia and NATO because the West is actually being quite invasive in terms of actions against Russian carriers.
You've been critical about the West's lack of resolve to clamp down on Russia's circumvention of sanctions by the way it's doing business via these third-party countries in South America, Central Asia, Middle East, Turkey. The EU has just introduced new sanctions against Belarus to try and stop Russia using it as a backdoor to get EU-sanctioned products. How significant do you think that is?
Well, it's incremental. Russia uses many different countries to try and circumvent sanctions. Obviously, President Lukashenko in Belarus is a partner, an ally, perhaps, of Russia. I mean, there are difficulties in that relationship, which is why I was a little bit nervous about calling them allies. But certainly, Lukashenko has helped the Russians, certainly. It's somewhat, it helps, it closes a loophole, or hopefully helps to close a loophole. But with sanctions, there's many, many moving parts. There's, incredibly complex. Russia is a big economy. It's very integrated with the global economy, has many trade partners. There's many routes by which it can get imports in and exports out. It involves a huge effort by Western governments to kind of maintain sanctions in place. And, there are a lot of players in the West and in those third countries and in Russia that try and get around them. So, it's a constant battle. And obviously the Belarus action is part of that overall strategy.
Let's talk about the seized Russian assets. You want more than $3 billion of Russian government cash in international banking systems to be given. Is it given or loaned to Ukraine that you want that to be done? And what could Ukraine actually do with that sum of money?
Well, there's actually $330 billion of Central Bank of Russian cash in our bank accounts, in Western bank accounts, and that's Russian taxpayer money. So here's the angle, and here's the pitch to you. I mean, this war is costing the West $100 billion a year. And that's Western taxpayer money that's been paid to keep Ukraine, help Ukraine defend itself. Meanwhile, so we're spending that, our taxpayer money, while we have this lump of Russian money just sat doing nothing in bank accounts. It's extraordinary. It should be a political scandal, actually, that the aggressor has not paid a penny of reparations, and meanwhile we're paying all this money. So the money's there. There is a legal basis for it to be seized. But the Europeans are terribly kind of nervous about doing this. And there's opposition in Belgium, in Italy, in Germany in particular, to it. And, I think in the end, they need to get the big picture. If Ukraine doesn't get the money to survive and win the war, it loses. What are the consequences of a Ukrainian defeat? I would argue tens of millions of Ukrainians will move west. We'll face a huge security risk from Russia. We'll have to increase defense spending massively. Those migrants moving west will cause more social and political upheaval in Europe. It will play to the hands of populists in Europe. It will destabilize Europe. That's the reality. That's terrible for the euro. And the ECB is one of the players arguing against this. So I would argue, if we're not going to use frozen Russian assets, I mean, it's clear there's a moral issue. There's an issue of equity. Again, why should Western taxpayers pay? But if we're not going to use that money, where is the money going to come from? Who is going to pay? The ECB hasn't said that. So the money's there. It should be used. It will ensure Ukraine's victory. It can be used for lots of different things. It can be used to fund its defense. It can buy weapons to defend itself. It can be used for recovery and reconstruction. The $100 billion a year I mentioned just to survive, that doesn't include recovery and reconstruction. The World Bank has done a report. It suggests that the cost of reconstruction of Ukraine is about $500 billion, and it's rising every day. Who's going to pay for that? Are Western taxpayers going to pay? I don't think they are willing to, given cost of living crisis and politics in Europe and the US, etc. The obvious source of funding Ukraine's victory in war and its recovery is these frozen Russian assets. Why are we doing nothing? Why are we not touching Russian taxpayer money in bank accounts in the West? Extraordinary.
Okay, I suppose that the compromise situation that we have at the moment is the move towards using the profits on those assets, and the EU's found this legal loophole to do that and push ahead to use profits. Obviously, much less money we're talking about than the 300 plus billion dollars, and the G7 is hoping to use that loophole as well to allocate the $50 billion worth of future proceeds it wants for Ukraine. It's a move, and I'm sure you're going to say that's just too little and too cautious. But do you think we are gradually edging towards more of a kind of financial conflict situation over this?
Look, as you mentioned, it doesn't touch the sides in terms of Ukraine's needs, right? I mentioned $100 billion a year for Ukraine to survive. Probably to win the war, to go on the offensive, it's about $150 billion, right? The interest from those 330 billion of immobilized Russian assets in Western banks, it generates about 3 to 4 billion euros a year. So 3 to 4 billion euros versus 100 to 150 billion. It's not a game changer now. As you mentioned, the G7 have come up with this fix. It's window dressing. It will generate perhaps 50 billion euros. But again, in the context of 100 billion to 150 billion dollars a year need, 50 billion is not enough. Now, interestingly, if you think again of that 100 billion that we've provided already a year, so actually it's 215 billion total since the war started. The US provides about 40% of that, or has done. Now, what happens if Trump wins in November? He said he's going to cut funding off to Ukraine. Is Europe going to fill that gap? I don't think so. Again, what happens if we don't fund Ukraine? It loses the war. That's terrible for European security. So we need to think really quickly, right? I mean, we can't afford a gap in Ukrainian funding. If there's a gap, it loses. That's the harsh reality.
Yeah. And when you hear people who are more cautious than you are about these frozen assets saying things like it's going to undermine confidence in the US global financial system, I mean, I presume you say no, that's not going to happen. But what do you say to those people who have those fears?
Okay, there are a number of objections to the use of frozen Russian assets. One is the legal issue. There's an argument called countermeasures that provides a framework for seizing frozen Russian assets. It actually argues that sovereign immunity, a government's assets are immune from confiscation under international law only as long as the country abides by international law. And clearly, Russia isn't. And in a period when it's out of compliance with international law, sanctions can be implied, including seizing their assets. So I think the legal case is clear. Now, the other arguments are, as you mentioned, that if we seize these assets, that they'll undermine confidence in the euro, in the dollar, in sterling, etc. I would argue and particularly amongst other countries that hold Western currencies and reserve assets, the Gulf states, China. Actually, we've already had a situation where the assets have effectively been taken away from Russia, right? They've been immobilized. They've been put out of Russia's use. Russia cannot access them. We're just saying, please, let's use them to help Ukraine win the war and defend itself. Now, the message to countries like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, China, has already been sent, right? If you act against international law, your assets in Western jurisdictions are at risk. But we've seen no evidence of any movement of their assets out of Western jurisdictions. The assets were frozen very early after the invasion in February 22. Zero evidence of movement out of the dollar, out of the euro, and out of Western jurisdictions, right? They haven't done it already. They're not going to do it. I would also argue that, in particular for the euro, if we don't do this and we don't secure Ukraine's financing, a Ukrainian defeat is a disaster for the euro as a project. As I've mentioned, tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west, political, social, and economic instability in Europe, a huge need to increase defense spending. This 1% of GDP, well, the 2% of GDP NATO target likely will have to go to 3% of GDP. That means increasing European defense spending by another 200 billion euros. Is that euro positive? I don't think so. I think the whole European project will be in doubt and jeopardy. That's the biggest risk to the euro, I would argue, in terms of its stability. It's losing this war because people like Lagarde at the ECB have been overly cautious. The other arguments are things like, well, what about Western assets in Russian jurisdiction? Putin will just go and retaliate by seizing those assets, right? He's already doing that. And you could also say, well, actually, those companies who have assets in Russia are just stupid. I mean, they made bad investment decisions. They shouldn't now be bailed out by Western taxpayers writing a check to cover the cost of the war when there's frozen Russian assets in Western jurisdictions that we should be using. But we're bailing out those companies that basically took Putin's 40 pieces of silver, right? They made huge profits from working with the Putin regime. They made the wrong decision. We shouldn't change our national security policy in effect to bail these guys out.
Meanwhile, Timothy, Ukraine has to fight a war by keeping its economy afloat. How is that economy holding up?
Well, remarkably well, actually. I mean, it's growing at a faster pace than the Russian economy. Its inflation is lower than the Russian economy. We just had the first quarter GDP numbers, 6.5% growth, pretty remarkable from a low base. You know, the durability of the Ukrainian, the fact that banks work, that the currency works, it's stable, that the transport system, infrastructure, mobile phones work is utterly extraordinary. And, you know, it's because of a number of reasons. One, Ukraine has, despite all the talk about corruption and rule of law, has a very strong cadre of capable technocrats running the, you know, good people at the central bank, good people at the Ministry of Finance. We saw a lot of reforms in Ukraine in the period after the Euromaidan in 2014-15 that cleaned up the banking sector, cleaned up the central bank. There is underlying trust in the banks, in money, in the central bank. That's really, really helpful. Also, it's helped that the West has provided about $40 billion a year in budget support. I mentioned the 100 billion total support. That includes military, but just the budget support to Ukraine has been about $40 billion. The problem is, again, if we go back to the financing, if there is, you know, a Trump presidency or Europe falters in terms of its willingness to support Ukraine, if those numbers begin to drop, we will see a shortfall in budget financing. They will have to print money to cover the budget. It will mean inflation, hyperinflation, currency adjustment. One of the big positives about the macro stability that we've seen is that the Ukrainians have been able to focus on fighting the war. They haven't had to worry about macroeconomic destabilization. There's been some stability. It's been one less problem for the Ukrainians to think about, but they need money from us. And as I said, you know, we have to absolutely assure Ukraine's financing to make sure that they can win the war. There's macro stability. And unfortunately, I think the outlook for the financing of Ukraine is very uncertain at this point in time.
And how are businesses actually coping with the challenge of generating a workforce when the country needs a fighting force?
Yes, I mean, it's difficult, especially when, you know, there are many people at the front. Ukraine has lost a lot of people through out-migration. Some have come back, but not that many. Obviously, there's been a ramp up in women in the workforce. They've made an incredible contribution. But it's difficult, right? And it's been a pressure towards inflation. But, you know, I think the innovation that the Ukrainians have shown in surviving for 2.5 years against a supposed global power has been extraordinary. You know, if you look at the military technology front, look at drones, what they've achieved, you know, it is remarkable. You know, very brave people in the front line for us against Putin's expansion. We owe them, you know, a huge debt of gratitude. And, you know, I think we need to provide a bit more finance for them. And again, those frozen Russian assets are pretty critical there. But there's been a lot of durability. And it gives you a lot of hope when the war ends in terms of Ukraine's ability to bounce back from the war, right? You know, there'll be a huge reconstruction story going on. There's a low base recovery. And then all the innovation and enterprise that we've seen from Ukrainians through this war should hold the country in relatively good stead when the war ends. And also the big positive for Ukraine now is this: they finally have an EU accession anchor.
Do you have, it might be impossible to answer this question, but do you have any sense about what effect how big the black market is at the moment in Ukraine? People who may be wanting to avoid conscription by not officially registering to work, but working on the quiet. Do you have an idea what kind of impact that's having on the economy?
No, it's hard to gauge that. I mean, in the UK, it's hard to figure out, the boys from the black stuff, whatever. I mean, or boys and girls from the black stuff. I mean, it's very difficult to gauge. In emerging markets in general, it is quite big. Ukraine's no different to that. I assume it's increased because of the war. People do pay to avoid going in the military. I guess we saw that in the Second World War in the UK. It's just a natural thing. Unfortunately, it's an impediment, I guess, on the military performance, an impediment on the economy, but it is one of those things.
The US ambassador to Beijing has said that China has effectively sided with Russia. What do you see as China's long-term strategy, and what opportunities do you think it sees that it can exploit in this war?
Well, I'm not sure I'd necessarily agree with him. I would argue that actually the Chinese could have done a lot more to support Russia in the war. They've tried to avoid they certainly haven't provided significant military support. The fact that Putin has to go to North Korea to beg for munitions, and also he's dependent on Iranian drones, suggests they're not really getting that much from the Chinese. The Chinese have been very mindful because their key relationship is not with Russia, it's with the US, right? I mean, the Chinese story is they think that globalization is still really important to their ultimate economic hegemony with the US, right? That's what they want. They want normalization on global markets. They want the Americans to stop imposing tariffs. And they've kind of used the war in Ukraine to suggest to the Americans that maybe they shouldn't be overly aggressive in terms of its tariffs and its restrictions on Chinese exports to the US. And I think that's really been the case. The Biden administration have pulled its punches really in terms of what it's done on China, because it knows if it's overly aggressive, the Chinese will go all in supporting Putin in Russia. In terms of Russia-China relations, the two are not natural partners particularly. There's a lot of tensions between the two. The Russians are obviously very worried long term about its Far East. They have this huge expanse of territory with no people in it and lots of resources. The Chinese have lots of people and not many resources. So, they're worried about Chinese encroachment on territory. The Chinese have exploited the Russians. They've exploited Russian weakness. They've taken, because of sanctions, they've basically taken lots of cheap Russian commodities, knocked down prices. And as I said, they're also charging top dollar prices for exports to Russia. Interesting, if you think of the Beijing Olympics just prior to the invasion, early 2022, the Russians were making a big thing about the fact when Putin arrived in Beijing that they were equal partners. What is crystal clear now is they're not equal partners. Russia is very much the junior dependent partner. And Russia's, I think, global position has been much eroded because of this invasion. In the end, many people think that Putin is a genius. Many UK politicians have suggested that. The reality is Putin's got dragged into a war that he hasn't been able to win, and it's 2.5 years later. Huge loss of soldiers, 500,000. Huge loss of economic results. I would estimate something like $1 trillion have been lost to the Russian economy because of the war. Russia's status globally massively reduced. Again, this idea China-Russia. Clear. Russia is totally dependent now on China. So I think, in the end, this is not really a winning strategy from Putin.
So how long do you think Moscow can afford financially and politically to fight the war in Ukraine?
Well, it still has reserves. It's a police fascist state. Putin controls the media narrative. He can force people to the front lines. Russia is still a huge country, big population, 140 million people. But what I would say is, the longer the war goes on, the bigger the risk to Putin of another Prigozhin. I mean, it's remarkable. Remember 1 year ago, Prigozhin and his troops, the Wagner brigades, were a couple of 100 kilometers outside Moscow. We were all looking at the flight data to see if Putin and Medvedev were fleeing. That's only a year ago. the longer it goes on, there is a risk of something happening within the country against Putin. And I'm not sure he'd particularly want to risk that. The longer the war goes on, it doesn't get any better for Russia. More casualties, more loss of economic power, more erosion of its international standing. I would think eventually I think actually Putin would probably want to talk peace now. The question is obviously, what the deal would be, whether the Ukrainians will be willing to negotiate. But I think perhaps towards the end of the year, there may be some scope for some kind of negotiation.
When you stand back from this in your position, what are your takeaways from the whole experience since the full-scale invasion?
Well, we've realised that, fortunately, Russia didn't win. If you go back to those first few days, Western intelligence thought he would invade and thought it would be over in 2 weeks. Thank God that didn't happen. Imagine a scenario that he had won in 2 weeks. All those bad scenarios I pointed out, tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west, social, political instability in Europe, a massive increase in defence spending as a result, potential for Putin to go further. He would be energized, he will be cocky, arrogant, confident. Where would Putin stop? Thank God the Ukrainians held the line. It's bought us time. It's bought us time to realise the threat from Russia. Remember, Macron made the famous statement just prior to the invasion that NATO is brain dead. It's not brain dead anymore. It's crystal clear who the threat is, what it is, and what we need to do. We need to increase defence spending to improve our defences against future threats from Russia. And also, I mean, in the end, Russia is a relatively small economy, $1.8 trillion. The West is $40 trillion, more than 20 times the size of the Russian economy. We have unbelievable power to make sure Putin doesn't win. We've been too constrained in the use of that power. Now, I think it's interesting. We've all learned as the war has gone on. I mean, initially, I think we all thought that Putin had escalation dominance. He cared about Ukraine more than us. He was, willing to do anything to stop Ukraine and stop the West in Ukraine. What we've now learned is he is actually scared of the West. We set red lines, or he sets red lines, doesn't keep them. Just think over here that initially we were very careful about the supply of conventional equipment. Big debates about T-72s, MiG-29s, HIMARS, Leopard tanks, F-16s, long-range missiles. Lots of reasons why we shouldn't do it. We're worried about what Russia's would do. Actually, we've supplied those weapons and there's been no reaction. There's been no reaction because I think Putin realizes Russian military technology has massively underperformed in Ukraine. Massively. Second generation NATO kit has basically beaten fourth generation Russian kit. He knows in a direct confrontation with NATO, Russia would lose very quickly because of the massive technological advantage. So I think it's moderated what he's done. I think the other interesting angle is he hasn't used weapons of mass destruction. People thought he would. I think one of the factors there's been China. China, I think, has given guardrails to him. The Chinese have said, don't do that. That would be massively disruptive to global markets. We don't want that. And actually, the Chinese angle is interesting. Another conclusion is perhaps not for me, but for the Chinese. And going back to that performance of Russian military technology, it's performed so badly, and the Chinese essentially use the same variants. If you were the Chinese looking at the failure of Putin in Ukraine, you would also think on Taiwan. Can we? Well, one conclusion is don't get involved in a war that you can't win. And I think the Chinese would be questioning their ability to win a war in Taiwan quickly because of how poorly Russian military technology has performed. And again, they use a variant of it. So I think it's reduced the chances of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, at least for a few years, until they perhaps draw some conclusions in terms of how Russia performed militarily and reform their own army because of it. So lots of things to take out from that. One is thank God, Putin didn't win initially. We now know how weak Russia is. Actually, he's scared of the West. He respects power. We have, we can deter Putin. We have the power to stop him, to deter him, but we're afraid to use that power, to deploy that power. And also, as I said, the other conclusion is I think China will be less reluctant to take action in Taiwan, which is a positive, I guess.
A very interesting thought to end on. Thank you so much, Timothy Ash. It's been great talking to you.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.